All right, I think we're ready to get started. So welcome everyone to our March Node-RED Ask Me Anything session. Thank you for joining us. This is the second time we've done this, and we're very much looking forward to answering, hearing it from their questions and answering them today. With me, I have Nick O'Leary and Rob Marcer. Nick is well known as one of the co-creators of Node-RED, and he's also the CTO of FlowForge. And Rob Marcer is a longtime Node-RED user, and he's also the developer educator here at FlowForge. As I mentioned in the chat, it's always great to see where people are attending from. So please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and we want to be a friendly bunch here, right? So a couple of things that I wanted to just go over before we get going. We are recording this session, and we will post the recording for playback. We'll send you a recording, but I just want to make sure everyone knows that if you are asking a question, and we do sometimes let people come on and talk live, it will be recorded. I also want to encourage everyone to use the Q&A pod for your question. Don't ask your question in the chat. It's really hard to track in the chat. In the Q&A pod, it's really easy for us to track those. Okay. Without further ado, please feel free to start asking questions. We do have some asked questions that we're going to start with. But we will absolutely get to the live questions as they start to come in. So for the first one, and this came from a gentleman by Alec, and so is there a difference between having many of one node versus one node that uses the link nodes? For example, using a node that tracks sunset, is there a difference between having 20 sunset nodes versus one set node that uses the link node to push the sunset message? So Rob, do you want to handle that?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending. Okay, so it depends is the very short and perhaps unhelpful answer to that. So, but yeah, what might make you decide to go for one approach rather than another? So sometimes in Node-RED, you will duplicate things that perhaps if you're writing code, you might just have one function that deals with something, because it might make it easier to read the flow if you have more than one instance of the same node. Might mean that when you come back to it a week, a month, or a year later, you actually can more easily track the messages as they run through your flow. So that might be a reason for why you might decide to have multiple instances rather than one. On the flip side, you might find that if whatever, say, talking, and by the sounds of it, I think this might be talking to perhaps an external API or maybe some light sensor. But if you duplicate that and have that in lots of places, you might find that if you then need to make changes to that, you're then going to have to go through and make those changes in all of those individual places. So you could potentially do that using a subflow, and then maybe you could get the best of both worlds, perhaps. But yeah, I mean, for me, I think trying to make sure that your flow is easy to read is quite important. Certainly, perhaps if you're going to have to come back to it at some point in the future, and having duplicates of nodes sometimes can help with that.
Great. Okay. I don't think Alec is on, so we'll go on to the next. We usually allow for follow-ups. So next question, and Nick, I think I'm going to ask you to handle this one. How did temporary block the multiple loops after splitting for debugging purposes?
So this is a question around, well, it's a great question around with Node-RED. It talks specifically about if you have a flow using the split node, so one message comes in, the split node splits it up into multiple, you can then do some work on each of those messages, and then perhaps a join node brings them back together. So that's one of the patterns we have, instead of creating for loops and that sort of loops you might be more familiar with in traditional programming. So the question was how to temporarily block when you've got lots of loops and you're trying to debug because you've got lots of things flowing through. I think there's a couple different approaches. One would be you just build a temporary flow, perhaps with a switch node that pulls out the messages you're interested in and passes them to debug. But often that's not really an appropriate approach, where you're adding debug flows into your existing flows. So an alternative is a plugin that's available for Node-RED, the Flow Debugger. So this is something we published, well, quite well, last year, maybe even earlier than that. And it's a plugin for Node-RED that actually lets you add breakpoints to your flows. And when it's enabled, whenever a message hits a breakpoint, it actually pauses the runtime and lets you examine the messages. I mean, I can pull up a quick demo of that if I am successful in sharing the right bit of my screen. Let's try this. So hopefully here you can see my Node-RED instance I've got running locally. It's a simple flow. I'm injecting an array of 1, 2, and 3 as words. I have a split node, a function node that is just going to convert each message to uppercase, and then a join node that will pull those back together into a single array and debug. So when I inject this, you can see my lowercase 1, 2, 3 has become uppercase 1, 2, 3. A super contrived example, but that's what we're doing. So I have the Node-RED Flow Debugger installed, which is this Node-RED debugger in the Flow library. You can install it just like you do any other Node module, and it gives you this debugger tab. So when it's, we first enable it, and once it's enabled, whenever I hover over a port, I now get this blue hover little shape appear. And what I can do is if I click on it here, that has set a breakpoint at that point of my flow, and you can see it's listed over here. So with it enabled and with that breakpoint set, I'm now going to inject the message again. And because messages have hit that breakpoint, it's paused all my flows, and it's telling me, you can see there, I've got 3 messages have queued up at this port. And in fact, I can see them all here. So it actually lets me examine, examine the messages. And you can see here, I've got payload 1, payload 2, and payload 3. And what I can do here is I can, like you can with normal code debuggers, I can step them through. So it's literally just processing the next event. So you can see one of my messages is now being passed to the function node. And as I step through the events, this is all in the order that the runtime is processing them. You can see now I've got one message on the input, which is this message up here with 3 in lowercase, but you can see messages are starting to come out of the function node with having been converted to uppercase. And I should say, this messages list is the order that the runtime is going to be processing these events. So yeah, I can just keep stepping through and examining the messages at each step. I can even, it gives me the ability to step a message out of order. I can actually delete a message, which I won't, because that will the join node is going to be waiting for 3 messages. So I'm not going to delete one because that will stop it working. And at any time I can just hit play to resume, and the flow carries on, and another message comes in and it pauses again. So yeah, the Node-RED debugger, it's provides that sort of stepwise capability in flows. Super interesting. It's something I don't think we've made enough of in the community, and because it's not installed by default, a lot of people, people who missed the original announcement about it perhaps don't know about it. So yeah, something I'm keen for us to invest a bit more within the Node-RED community, and work on some of the other features, because we really want to give users the tools to make it easy to debug flows without having to create elaborate flows that are only there to help you debug stuff. So yeah, that's the debugger.
I think there's always something in the Node-RED community that kind of people don't know about. So it's always great to bring kind of highlight some stuff too. So going on to the next question, is there kind of any update on the dashboard and the Node-RED dashboard node? Kind of Angular 1 is no longer maintained. So Rob, I know you've been doing some work on kind of writing an article about dashboard technology for Node-RED. Do you want to kind of take this one?
Yes, please. Yeah, this is perfect timing for me because I've spent the past couple of weeks, or perhaps a little bit longer, looking at dashboard, but also looking at some alternatives. Just to, so where dashboard is currently at. So yeah, as Ravi says, It's based on Angular 1, which is no longer maintained. I think that stopped being maintained at the end of 2021, I think it was. So it's a good while ago now. That probably, unfortunately, at some point in the future will result in dashboard not being a sensible thing to use. It could just completely break, or maybe there's a security problem with it. One thing is, despite the lack of maintenance for Angular 1 for the past however long it is, a year and a half, nothing has come up yet. So, you know, I'm not superstitious, so I'm fine with saying that. Nothing's gone wrong yet, so that isn't going to mean that something's going to go wrong tomorrow. But yeah, I mean, it is still usable, but there is a risk of potentially a bug or a security problem coming up with Angular 1, which would affect that. As I've said, I've been looking into this a bit recently. I've been looking at some alternatives, and the alternatives I've been looking at is one project called FlexDash and another one called UI Builder, which are both, they are quite different, I think it's fair to say, to each other in the way in which they approach building dashboards, but I think they are both quite good and are under significant development with quite well planned out roadmaps, and I think they will become better and better alternatives. The reason I've been doing all of this research is I'm about to publish an article on this on the FlowForge blog. I suspect I'm going to say definitely in the next 5 days that will be published. I will hold myself to that. So yeah, that will have a lot of going through, you know, lots of different parts of each. So dashboard, FlexDash and UI Builder, and comparing, say, how easy they are to install, how easy they are to build demos, long-term support, development roadmap, all of these sorts of things. So hopefully that'll be really useful to you, Ravi, and potentially, other people who are listening to work out how you might want to do a dashboard for a next project.
And Ravi is with us, so I just wanted to if Ravi, do you have a follow-up question, or hopefully that answer was sufficient for you? But if you have to unmute yourself, but you can ask a follow-up question if you would like to. You don't have to though.
That's okay. That's done.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, we actually have a live question, so we're going to kind of take from Garrett. How can we build subflows with dynamic instantiating? I mean, right now config nodes are fixed, but depending on the topic coming in, I would like to create and select the config node that is required. This would eliminate the need to having a lot of nodes, but only one node for the same functionality. Nick, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, to answer directly, how can we do it? The answer is right now you can't really. So the way that node relationships are established and how the runtime, how many nodes are designed, they expect the relation to what node they need to interact with to be part of the configuration they're passed when the node is created. And unless an individual node has been built to allow it to be dynamically changed, then that's not something that Node-RED can force on that node. Now, yeah, so that does make it tricky for some use cases like the one you've mentioned. There are some patterns I think that can help. I'm just trying to think if I can pull up a link. I don't think I can lay my hands on a link immediately for you, but certainly one of the areas which isn't quite as dynamic as you're looking for, but one of the reasons to use subflows is you want in your flow to create multiple instances of that subflow, and you want to be able to give each of those instances its own configuration to customize it somehow. The way that is done today is each subflow instance can define a set of its own environment variables, which are exposed to the nodes within that subflow. So that allows you to create an instance and then customize it through environment variables, which can get passed through to the configuration properties of the nodes within the subflow. So it's certainly possible to create a subflow that you can have each instance connect to a different database or a different MQTT topic or whatever it might be. But it still comes back to that has to be kind of statically defined at the start when you're designing your flows. Being able to create it fully dynamic is a real challenge and it does very much depend on the nodes you have and what systems you want to be able to interact with. So yeah, I don't think I can give you quite the answer you're looking for there, but that's kind of where we're at the moment with how subflows work.
And Gerd, I've kind of promoted if you'd like to ask a follow-up, or if you don't need to, but kind of certainly feel free if you want to ask a follow-up.
Yeah, hello. Do you hear me?
Yes, yep.
Okay, great. No, that was clear, and I understand now the reason why it's actually not possible. But just wondering if in the future you're actually thinking of supporting this kind of functionality of dynamically instantiating things.
It's not, well, it is not something we have on the roadmap. It is a question that does get asked from time to time. The reason it hasn't made it to the roadmap is because there isn't a clear and obvious way of how that would actually work in practice. So I wouldn't want to say, yes, keep an eye out, we'll get there eventually. It is one of those, I'm not convinced there is a good answer for how it would work, but it's something, again, in the community we can continue to explore and try and think through, and again, depending on the interest from the community for us to pursue that sort of dynamic instantiation, then we can dig deeper into it to see if we can find something that we've missed.
Right. Thanks, Gert, very, very much for your question. And again, don't be shy. Certainly kind of ask your questions in the Q&A pod, and we will certainly be able to get to them. We're going to skip over to a question from Igor, who's asked in advance. We have a complex workflow consisting of multiple steps involving third-party APIs requests, some of which take time to complete and may fail in the middle, so that the whole workflow needs to be automatically repeated after a certain timeout, even after the unintended Node-RED restart. What's the most easy way to solve this with Node-RED without building a complete custom retry logic based on database and queues? Do you want to try and take that, Rob?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, thanks. It's an interesting question. I don't think there is a simple solution to this without, as you've alluded to at the end, building something that can, to a certain extent, deal with it. I think it depends on to what extent, when something fails, you can recreate the state. So yeah, without knowing exactly, I mean, I've seen systems where they would recover from failure by repeating an entire flow if something, doesn't come out appropriately at the end. So, it saves something into memory and then looks for that coming back out the other end. But that might be a totally inappropriate suggestion for your needs. I don't know. I might actually ask Nick to see if he has any more thoughts on this, Nick. Because beyond what I've said, I can't, other than it kind of depends, but you may need to write your own solution to deal with it. So maybe you have something better.
Well, I don't think I do have anything better. It's one of those challenges of what can the Node-RED runtime do for you versus what do you need to build into your flows, and equally what primitives, what nodes could be provided to help build those sorts of flows. Being able to, it's kind of like transactionality with databases, where you start a transaction, you do a whole bunch of arbitrary work on the database, and then you can either complete or roll back the transaction, and the database takes care because it has full view of all that work. The challenge with the Node-RED flow is a Node-RED flow could interact with all sorts of external systems, internal state of nodes, a whole bunch of stuff. So trying to build a generic rollback mechanism for a flow is actually a super challenging problem. So it does then come back to, as Rob alluded to, designing a flow so that you are able to store state at key points, and for for your flow, for your application, you understand what it means when it comes back up to re-inject work at the right points. Actually, the previous question about some flows coming into this one does actually remind me deep in the history of subflows. We did spend some time looking at other types of subflow, one of which, once we had the concept of a subflow, what other features could we add? One idea that has not come to fruition, but this is 5-6 years ago, was the idea of being able to treat a subflow as a unit of work and have some way of tracking if a message goes into a subflow, does it come out? Or have some way to be able to treat a subflow as a thing with a timeout and allow a subflow to be a sort of I won't call it a transaction, but a subflow being a unit of work and what that would enable. As I say, at the time, it didn't come to much, and we had enough other things to do. But I think as we look at bigger applications with Node-RED and other use cases for it, having some good examples of how to build this sort of workflow recovery will be more important. So I think, yeah, that's certainly something I think we should have a look at building some good examples of.
And so Igor's here. Maybe he can kind of give us more insight into his specific example. Igor, can you or if you have a follow-up question too, right?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So thanks for picking my question, guys. Thank you very much, and thanks for the great tool, by the way. So to clarify the use case a bit, so the workflow is something that triggered externally. So essentially, it's a webhook triggered by external system, and then some steps need to happen in the middle, which include mainly HTTP requests to third-party systems like translation, transcription tool. Something, and all of these HTTP requests can fail, at some point. So, and of course, the frequency of these workflows, of these messages, could be 1 per minute, could be multiple times per second. So, and essentially, what the ideal solution would be some kind of easy way to repeat the whole workflow from the beginning if it reaches the timeout. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope that clarifies and answers the question.
No, absolutely. I appreciate that. And thank you for the question, Igor. I think it's a really interesting topic. And I think building robust flows is vital to creating flows that have business critical pieces flowing through it. So as I say, I think it's something we could look at, working up some good worked examples and looking for where are the common patterns, where do you end up repeating a lot of sets of nodes in order to achieve this? And are there some core nodes or contrib nodes that could be created to give you more of those primitives you need to build that flow much more succinctly and easily? So it's a really interesting topic for sure.
I have seen, just to add to that, and I will say something that might be a solution, but it might not be. I'll just talk until someone says, "Oh no, that's an awful idea." So I've seen people deal with this by running a SQLite database within the Node-RED instance, where they can just basically record the initial payload that came in, and then once it's been processed, they can take that back out of the database or flag it as being processed. The potential downside to that, and I think you mentioned this in your question, is if the Node-RED instance fails completely, unless you've got some sort of persistent disk, then there's not much point in having that payload stored in a SQLite database. But potentially an external database, or perhaps could facilitate that. Hopefully that's somewhat useful. I don't know if it's totally the best Node-RED way, but might be of use to you.
Essentially, what we did so far, we just keep, we just deal with external SQS queues. This is where we keep incoming data. and the statuses we keep inside the Amazon AWS DynamoDB, so that even if the Docker container with Node-RED completely crashes, well, we don't lose the statuses. But yeah, it's far too custom, and well, yeah, it grows even more complex with time. So we are looking for some easy solution. Yeah, right. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Igor. So moving on to the next question, and it's I guess from Kimber, and she's new to Node-RED, and she's coming from the automation and factory environments for sort of PLC program. So she's curious about what resources you recommend for examples of industrial applications and materials for learning the basics of Node-RED. I'm experimenting with pulling data from PLCs over many brands over Ethernet and Modbus. At this point, I'm just collecting data to present to in DBs and basic dashboards. I'm thinking about using it for low-level controls. So Nick or Rob, do you want to handle that?
Well, I wasn't sure from the question if you were saying you've never used Node-RED or if you have a certain level of competency and then you're wanting to look into those specific use cases.
I think she's really new to Node-RED. So
I did a webinar about a week and a half ago, which might be worth looking at. It's an hour long and covers some of the basics of using Node-RED. So I think that's okay, personally, and a good place to start. There is also a lot of really helpful resources on the Node-RED website as well, which is 90% of what I learned from just reading through those things. So yeah, maybe it'd be good to see if Kimber wants to add to that one, Claire. Yeah.
I would just, I would also say, good examples of Node-RED in industry. That's absolutely something we at FlowForge want to expand our sort of repertoire of content around. So, watch this space. But right now, there is a ton of great stuff on YouTube and even in the community around examples of using Node-RED in that space. So again, I can't necessarily point you to a specific resource other than I know there's great stuff. The community's great around producing that sort of content. So please do have a look around.
And I would also add I would suggest if you're using a certain PLC, often the PLC vendors have created Node-RED content around how to use Node-RED with their PLC. So you might go back to your PLC vendor and check that out. So Kimber, do you have a kind of a follow-up question? Hopefully we've helped a bit.
No, I don't have a follow-up question. Everything
okay.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for your question. So, so we're going to. Omri has a question. Given there are some limitations with subflow functionality and support, example support of link calls, context scopes, why not just use groups instead?
Yeah, I mean, it's often somewhat a personal preference. I see lots of flows built where people just don't use subflows at all, quite often. I think I probably fall more on the using groups than subflows. So I think with lots of things, maybe see what Nick thinks and more of the authority on the whys of Node-RED, but with lots of things, there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do it. It's what you find easiest to write, and then probably something that I definitely see from experience is what you will find easy to read in 6 months' time as well. So if you find it easier just to lay things out in groups, as I often do, then there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Nick, do you want to add to that? Or?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, they are two different approaches to a similar problem. There is a lot of overlap, but each does also bring its own additional capabilities. So I mean, one of the things I like with subflows, I like hiding complexity. So I do appreciate the fact I can have a complex bit of functionality that I want to reuse, but have it in my palette. So I can just drag instances on and make use of it. I know with groups, you could create a tab in the editor which has all that complex functionality in and use the link nodes to make it available elsewhere. But personally, I find then the link call node, which lets you call out to a link node and get a result back, it's great, but often when you're looking at a flow, it's you've got to make a bit more of a mental leap between the link call node and where it's calling. So personally, I prefer subflows for that type of use case. Groups I prefer when I'm trying to where it's lots of one-off bits of flows. I'm not reusing them, but I want to logically group and show, this is related to this bit of function, or that's related to that bit of function. Another advantage with subflows is it is possible to package up a subflow and publish it to NPM. So if you wanted to create a bit of functionality and actually share it as a node for other people, you can actually package subflows up as NPM modules and publish them to NPM, and then they appear like nodes for people who have installed it. For someone who installs one of those, they don't know it's a subflow, so they can't look at the internals, but that's how that works. So yeah, but as Rob said at the start, it's kind of personal preference as to what makes sense for what you're comfortable with. And remember, it's your code. You're the one who's maintaining it, or you're creating it for someone else to have to maintain, however it might be. Trying to create flows that are easy to maintain should personally, I think, takes the priority. And yeah, you make the choice for what you're comfortable with.
Omri, do you have a follow-up? Was that helpful?
No, thank you. That answers me. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks for your question. So Gert has another question, which I think is actually pretty interesting. So right now, config is passive environment variables, as Nick said. So we need to configure an instance of a Node-RED. Right now, we have to supply systemd service the environment variable, actually a container but managed with Podman. If we think about provisioning devices at manufacturing sites, sometimes this is a problem. I'd actually like to have a USB inserted with encrypted password. Then the flow gets these and gives to the configuration. So, for example, AWS device and Mendo device can be provisioned without password being visible to any person in production, to any person in the production facility. So this is a very long question, but here's the question. Is there a way we can accomplish this, passing passwords to config nodes, other than with environmental variables per se, we can be more secure in the production process? So Nick, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so environment variables is the primary way of doing it, because again, nodes only use the configuration they're given, and it's the runtime that takes care of taking the environment, recognizing when a node's configuration is a placeholder for an environment variable and inserting in the value before it's given to the node. So that's the mechanism we have today, which gets a very long way. And all the sorts of platforms like with FlowForge, where you can set environment variables against the project, it's still fundamentally environment variables. Now, to Gert's point around, in some environments, environment variables aren't always considered as secure. That is true. We don't currently have a built-in way. One approach would be to do some pre-processing outside of Node-RED, where you have a system that can extract those passwords from the secure system and essentially injects them into the flow configuration before it gets loaded by the runtime. So they're not in environment variables, they're sort of injected into the flow. There are ways and means of doing that. It involves sort of a custom storage plugin that knows how to do that. It's a little involved, but technically feasible. So again, I'm happy to follow up after the I think we'd get deep in the weeds of how that could be done, because I'm sort of, as you may tell, just thinking through how I would do it as I talk. So I'd be more than happy to follow up after today on that with you. But yeah, environment variables is the primary route to achieving that.
So great. I opened your mic, but it might be more interesting to kind of do a follow-up with Nick afterwards, if that's okay. Or if you have a quick follow-up, please feel free.
Okay, no problem. I'll have a follow-up with Nick after this. Thank you for the explanation so far.
Great. Thanks, Gert. Great questions.
Perfect. Okay, going on to the next question. Is there a way to create custom node UI using React? If I create complex Node-RED node UI, then single HTML file gets bigger and it's difficult to manage.
There are ways of doing it. It's not something I've done or we do in the core of the project. Rob, in an earlier question, talked about FlexDash. And I think what Torsten has done, who works with FlexDash, is he's built his own personal framework for creating node UIs using Vue. Okay, it's not React, but I think a lot of the principles are the same. So he's created his own sort of personal plugin for supporting creating his own node UIs using Vue. So there is a precedent there for creating node UIs using whatever toolkit you want. Now, there are certainly some challenges, because if every node went that route, all wanting their own version of Vue, all loading their own version of the library, it gets unwieldy. And this is one of the reasons why Node-RED hasn't been very opinionated at all about using any toolkits for creating node UIs, and why we kind of stick to vanilla HTML, JavaScript, jQuery. But jQuery has kept the web running for a long time and will continue doing so for much longer than a lot of these toolkits have. So yeah, we do get asked, why doesn't Node-RED support this toolkit or that toolkit? And it's frankly, those toolkits move and evolve so quickly. We'd end up investing far more of our time just trying to stay current and supporting stuff that we wouldn't be able to do everything else we do with Node-RED. So that's kind of why the core of Node-RED hasn't gone down the route of going with one of those particular toolkits. But that said, I do acknowledge for more complex node UIs, it's not as fun to develop in vanilla HTML and jQuery than it is using some of these toolkits. So I was interested to see what Thorsten had done to add Vue support for his stuff. There's part of me I would like to see a bit more of a standardized approach, but that's kind of where things are at with the community at the moment.
Okay. Alok, I've opened your mic, so you can ask a follow-up if you have one.
That's all good. I'm actually using Node-RED for 3 years, and I was quite happy. This is the only thing that I found so far difficult, little bit when creating the complex Node-RED UI, especially for the custom nodes. But that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Right. Well, thank you, Alok.
Perfect.
Great to hear from you.
So just we don't have any more live questions. So if anyone has some, we do have a couple more kind of pre-asked questions. So we'll kind of go back to those. We had a question from Paul Deng about creating customer nodes and kind of a whole bunch of issues around customer nodes. And really, it's just kind of asking about kind of either tutorials or stuff around customer nodes. So what advice do you give kind of Nick and Rob about kind of to people who are going to create custom nodes? How do they get started? What resources should we be using?
I mean, my approach is often, this is the great thing with the Node-RED community, and yeah, one of the big successes of why Node-RED has got to where it's got is I'm going to say over 4,000, and I know that number is out of date. So let me, as I talk, I'm going to go and find what the number is. But yeah, just the wealth of nodes that are already out there that people have created. So a good starting point is often find a node that is kind of adjacent to what you're interested in, assuming there's not one that already if there's one that already does what you're interested in, we would always recommend collaborate with and add, see if you can get your features added to that person's node, rather than creating lots of nodes that are very similar but subtly different or forks of each other. Anyway, find a node that is kind of adjacent to what you're wanting to achieve and learn from it. There is the Node-RED.org documentation on creating nodes, which again, it covers the basics. It doesn't, and again, I would appeal to the community if you think the docs can be improved. That is, in many ways, documentation improvements are improvements to the project above all others that help the whole community. So yeah, the Node-RED docs, learn from other nodes, get stuck in and try it. When I saw this question come up, talking to Rob earlier, I said, well, you know, that would be a great topic for one of our future webinars that we hold each month, would be to do a session on you know, creating a Node-RED node from scratch. I think that would be, and then we can get into some of, so Paul's asked some, on this topic, he's asked some quite detailed low-level questions, which I think are a bit too deep in the detail for us to try and get into in this context, but I'm happy, Paul, to follow up afterwards. Yeah, answer any of your questions. And the Node-RED forum is a great resource. You know, there are plenty of Node authors happily answering questions and how-tos on there. So yeah, I think just draw on the community, because it's a great community.
Yeah, no, for sure. I don't think actually Paul's on, so I can bring him up for a follow-up. So just for everyone who's here with us live, this is going to be, so we don't have any kind of live questions left. So if you have some, please put them into the Q&A pod. And we've got, I think, just one more pre-asked question. Actually, a couple more, but we'll say kind of, are there any stress test reports about Node-RED? So maybe we'll just generalize this kind of what testing kind of reports kind of get published around Node-RED.
Well, I think one of the common questions we ask is around sort of a performance guide for, you know, what is the performance of Node-RED, and having tackled that question in previous roles, not on Node-RED but on other products, it is very much how long is a piece of string type of questions, because it depends on so many factors that it's hard to give a meaningful answer to say Node-RED can do X messages a second, because it depends so much on your flows, particularly with the Node-RED flow that could be interacting with all sorts of external systems, databases, APIs, hardware. Each one is going to provide some sort of bottleneck, and that no amount of magic on the Node-RED side is going to be able to make go away. So we don't have, and we don't publish any sort of performance reports on Node-RED. What we have done is, and talked to users before, is very much around working out how can you optimize flows, what can you do to build flows that are going to be performant, and avoid the trap of trying to prematurely optimize, because then you will spend the time optimizing entirely the wrong thing in your flows. There was a lot of chatter around the function node. The function node is, has a lot of overhead and slows flows down and this and that. Whereas in reality, when you tested it, the function node has a bit of a memory footprint, but is actually in many cases faster than some of the other nodes, because you're running bespoke JavaScript code that's doing exactly what you want, rather than going through some of the abstraction of a Node-RED flow that the nodes are more general. So it's very much one of those, optimize when you need to optimize, and be careful to optimize the right thing. When you're trying to evaluate Node-RED for your use case, you really think about what workload you are expecting to push through it, and what are the targets you want to set for yourself, and evaluate it on those terms. On the right sort of representative hardware running it, memory, CPU allocation, all those are factors that have a bearing on what the performance of a Node-RED runtime is, rather than the core of Node-RED itself. That said, we're always interested in looking at where there are bottlenecks in the core of Node-RED, where are there optimizations we can make along the way. That, I think that's a really interesting topic, and if there are people in the community interested in doing that sort of analysis and deep dive of what sort of optimizations we can get out of the Node-RED runtime, yeah, I would very much welcome that in the community and having a conversation around that in the community, because yeah, I realize my answer is a bit of a non-answer by saying we don't do it, but I also recognize the importance of the performance of the runtime and making sure it does what our users need it to do. So yeah.
Great. And I think just stressing the importance of it is Node-RED is a community, right? So people I guess, what's the easiest, so if someone wanted to say they wanted to do some stress testing, how would they get started? Do they open an issue in the GitHub repo, or how would you suggest they get started for something like that?
I would always start that in the Node-RED community forum. That would be the best place to start that conversation, because again, we tend to ask people to use the forum rather than the GitHub issue list in the first instance. We may, for some topics, we then may choose to move it to GitHub, often because a lot of the traffic we get are, there's a far wider audience on the forum of people who have experience and can help than those who watch the GitHub issue list. So the forum is a great resource for that, and that's where for any sort of contribution you're interested in making, that would be the first port of call. And if not, there is the Node-RED Slack, which is I'm always lurking in, and that's a good place to reach out if you want to talk to me directly sometime.
All right. So it looks like we have one more question that just came in live, so we'll take that and then we'll call it a day. From Omri, are there any plans or thoughts of enabling nodes to receive messages from more than one input port? Example, to clearly separate control versus payload messages.
No, I think is that's a succinct answer. As in, no plans, but it is something we have put thought into. So I would, again, it is a question that gets asked on the forum, and there's quite a lot of discussion on the forum on that topic. So rather than try and rehearse all of the reasons for why that isn't something we're looking at doing, please do have a search on the forum for that topic. But essentially, it's whenever we've looked at it, it feels it doesn't really get to the heart of. It doesn't really solve the problem in the way people think it might. Anyway, I'm at risk of. It's one of those topics that does generate a lot of interesting, heated discussion between those who think we absolutely must have multiple inputs and those who think we shouldn't. And right now, the weight of opinion is that no, we're going to stick to a single input.
All right, I think we're done. So thank you, Nick and Rob, and thank you everyone for the great questions. Really much appreciate it. I want to we do these monthly. We also do monthly webinars, and our next webinar, Nick is going to be doing our next webinar at the end of March, and it's really an introduction to FlowForge. So we talk a lot about Node-RED, but we also are very proud and excited about the FlowForge platform. And so Nick is going to take us through an introduction to that. You can sign up for that at the webinar, at the link. I'll put the URL in the chat if you're interested in signing up for that webinar. When we close off this webinar, you'll be presented a survey, and I hope you take really just what do you think about this session? How can we improve in the session? So it's pretty lightweight. Hopefully you will spend some time to complete that survey. But thank you, Rob and Nick, and thank you everyone. And we'll do this again next month. Take care.
Right. Thanks everyone.